It looks like the response to the epidemic is going to suddenly and dramatically increase budget deficits across the world. So, according to this article from MarketWatch, trillions in coronavirus spending could explode deficits to World War II levels. The US could add $5 trillion in deficit spending to fight COVID-19. So, the US economy is 21 trillion, so 5 or 6 trillion is 25% of that. So that means in the United States, the deficit this year is going to be 25% of GDP, which is just unprecedented. Even during the height of the financial crisis, the highest the deficit was like 15% of GDP, and that was the highest it ever was since World War II. So this is just completely unprecedented, and this is coming from like out of nowhere. So if we add 25% of GDP on top of our already existing debt, which is 100% of GDP, 107% of GDP, that means by the end of the year our debt is going to be 130% of GDP. Now, if we're having to do deficits of 25% of GDP, it makes sense that other developed countries are also going to have to run similar sized deficits. So in the United States, our debt is, quote, moderate at 100% of GDP, but in countries like Italy and Japan, it's much higher. In Italy, debt is already 135% of GDP. So you add 25% of that, and that's going to leave debt at 160% of GDP at the end of the year if Italy runs similarly high deficits. In Japan, the debt is even higher, so 25% plus 240, means that the total Japanese debt is going to be 260% of GDP at the end of the year. At 100% of GDP, our total debt load is low enough so that we can sort of afford it if it's going to be like a one-time thing. But can Italy and Japan withstand debt loads that are 160% of GDP and 260% of GDP? Another matter is how the debt is going to be financed. So, total private savings in the United States in 2018 were 17% of GDP. So if the deficit is 25% of GDP, that's already more than the total savings in the entire country. Plus, because the economy stopped working and people are making no money, the total amount of savings is probably going to decline to like below 15% of GDP. That's where it declined to during the 2009 crisis. So already the total amount of private savings in the country is a whole 10 points below what the deficit is. So even if all private savings were redirected to the deficit, that still wouldn't cover it. Now, what might happen if it were just the United States running deficits like this would be that international borrowers would step in to finance the debt. But all countries are running deficits like this right now because this is a global crisis. So all the global savings, so funds elsewhere, are going to be absorbed by other countries' deficits. So there aren't enough private savings to finance the total deficit. And that's even if all private savings goes to government debt, which it might not. A large portion is probably still going to be hell-bent on being put into the private market for private uses. So there just isn't the money in savings to finance the debt solely through bond purchases, which means the Federal Reserve is going to have to monetize a good portion of the debt, like maybe half of it or 2/3. So we're just going to be printing the equivalent of 20% of our GDP into the deficit. And no, it's not going into like some obscure corporate bank account where the money's just going to sit there. We're actually sending it directly into consumers' bank accounts to spend it with. And because of the crisis, this is happening during a time of severe supply bottlenecks. If anything is going to cause inflation, this is going to be it. That all depends what happens to the economy. If we have to extend the lockdown for so long it causes a Great Depression, then yeah, it'll be disinflationary in spite of all the money printing we're doing. However, if we sort of landed our feet within a year, so we can turn the economy back on, yet all this new money is flowing into the economy because the Federal Reserve printed it, and then the US Treasury just sent it directly as checks into people's bank accounts, then yeah, if anything is going to cause inflation, then that would, under that scenario where we do have an eventual economic recovery. So this is going to be very interesting to see. So in the United States, maybe 10 percentage points of the deficit will be funded through bonds, and the other 15% is just going to have to be printed. In Germany, total private savings were 29% of GDP, so they might drop to 24% of GDP, and Germany might barely be able to finance their budget deficit without having to print money, but by just absorbing almost all of their savings into their deficit for that year. Or at the very least, they might finance most of their deficit through actual bonds and only have to print a little money. How about Italy? In Italy, their total private savings were 20% of GDP, so if it drops to 15% of GDP, they're still going to have to print a lot of it. And in Japan, total private savings were 25% GDP, but it looks like it could drop to 20% GDP. So again, a lot of the deficit's going to have to be printed. If Japan and Germany only monetize the minimal amounts of their deficit, and the bulk of it's funded through actual bonds from actual savers, then they're going to have huge trouble funding their additional debt because of the huge levels of debt they already have to pay off every year before. I meant Japan and Italy. So again, realistically, a large portion of private savings are still going to be dedicated to go into private uses. So if private savings falls to 20% GDP, then at least 5 points of those savings are not going to be used to finance government deficits. So that means the government's going to have to print at least 15 percentage points of the deficit. That seems to be the case in both Japan and Italy because they have similar private savings levels. If the bulk of their deficits are monetized, Japan and Italy will have less trouble with their total debt load, but that means there'd be a much higher inflation risk. Because if you are running deficits that high and sending the money directly into consumers' pockets, then if anything is going to cause inflation, that will. So they're actually going to have some actual inflation risk. So the situation's just completely unprecedented. Countries are talking about running deficits of 25% of GDP this year and increasing their debt loads by as much. The bulk of that might just be monetized completely and printed, which would mean inflation risks. And if it's not, then countries that already have very high debt levels like Japan and Italy are going to have even higher debt and even more trouble paying it back. So this is completely uncharted territory and completely unprecedented. And this all just came completely out of left field from nowhere. So I think that's basically what I have to say. Maybe I might read some articles on this in other videos, but not now. So if you liked my content, please subscribe to my channel, like the video, share the video with anyone you think might be interested in it, and leave your thoughts in the comments. See you later. Bye.